Hello, my name is John Olbrantz, and I'm the Mary Beth Collins Director of the Hallie Museum of Art at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon. I'm delighted to welcome you here to this series of 4 virtual lectures being presented in conjunction with our current exhibition, Forgotten Stories, Northwest Public Art of the 1930s, which continues through March 27, 2021 at the Hallie Museum of Art. Organized by curator Margaret Bullock for the Tacoma Art Museum, Forgotten Stories is the first major exhibition to celebrate the bounty of artwork created in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana under the New Deal federal art projects in the 1930s. Because of the current coronavirus pandemic and restrictions on social gatherings, and in order to help contextualize the exhibition, we've invited 4 humanities scholars to deliver virtual lectures on New Deal art, a history of the Depression, American literature in the 1930s, and science and technology during the Depression. The 4-part virtual lecture series, the first such lecture series that we've undertaken, has been made possible by a major grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, a federal agency, and we're most grateful to them for their belief in our ability to carry out such an ambitious and technologically innovative series of lectures. On a local level, I want to thank Hallie Museum of Art Education Curator Elizabeth Garrison for organizing and coordinating the virtual lectures, and the staff of Allied Video Productions here in Salem for filming and editing the lecture series and getting the various lectures ready for broadcast. Today's speaker is Mike Chasar. Mike is currently an associate professor in the English department at Willamette University. He received his BA degree in English, French, and Humanities from Valparaiso University in Indiana, his MA degree in creative writing from Miami University in Ohio, and his PhD degree in English and book studies from the University of Iowa. Mike teaches courses in American literature and creative writing with a special focus on poetry from the American Civil War to the present, as well as specialized courses on the literature of the Great Depression, the modern novel, Pacific Northwest literature and poetry, the graphic novel, and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass. A prodigious writer and scholar, Mike is the author of numerous articles, essays, and books on various aspects of American literature and poetry. His current book project, Oh, Ooh, and Oi, How 3 Little Sounds Key the Poetry of Pop Music, ties artists like Whitney Houston, Bon Jovi, Guns N' Roses, and Beyonce to the tradition of lyric poetry stretching back to Sappho and ancient Greece. Please welcome our speaker, Mike Chasar.
Sometime during FDR's second term, in 1938, H.C. Chappell, the longtime editor of Middlesboro, Kentucky's The Three States newspaper, started printing and selling a flyer that featured an inflammatory poem titled Rejected. It's a poem that is almost always printed without byline, or else credited to anonymous, but Chappell gave the byline to a certain V.M. Rodabaugh, about whom, mysteriously, I can find nothing in the historical record. In the poem, President Roosevelt dies and goes to hell, where the devil asks him, like St. Peter would at the gates of heaven, what he's done to deserve admission. In a long, rambling answer, FDR proceeds to list off his New Deal initiatives, taxes he raised, promises he broke, and so on. At the end, fearing for the security of his own job, the devil turns him away, hence the title, Rejected. Here is the poem in full. A stranger stood at the gates of hell, and the devil himself had answered the bell. He looked him over from head to toe and said, "My friend, I'd like to know what you have done in the line of sin to entitle you to come within." Then Franklin D., with his usual guile, stepped forth and flashed his toothy smile. "When I took charge in '33, a nation's faith was mine," said he. "I promised this and I promised that, and I calmed them down with a fireside chat. I spent their money on fishing trips, and I fished from the decks of their battleships. I gave them jobs on the WPA, then raised their taxes and took it away. I raised their wages and closed their shops. I killed their pigs and burned their crops. I double-crossed both old and young, and still the fools my praises sung. I brought back beer, and what do you think? I taxed it so high they couldn't drink. I furnished money with government loans. When they missed a payment, I took their homes. When I wanted to punish folks, I'd put my wife on the radio." I paid them to let their farms lie still and imported foodstuffs from Brazil. I'd curtail crops when I felt real mean and then shipped corn from the Argentine. When they'd start to worry, stew, and fret, I'd get them chanting the alphabet. With the AAA and the NLB, the WPA and the CCC, with these many units, I got their goats, and still I crammed it down their throats. My workers worked with the speed of snails while the taxpayers chewed their fingernails. When the organizers needed dough, I closed up the plants for the CIO. I ruined jobs, and I ruined health, and I put the screws on the rich man's wealth. And some who couldn't stand the gaff would call on me and how I'd laugh. When they'd got too strong on certain things, I'd pack and head for old Warm Springs. I ruined their country, their homes, and then I placed the blame on 9 old men. Now Franklin talked both long and loud, and the devil he stood, and his head he bowed. At last he said, "Let's make it clear, you'll have to move, you can't stay here. For once you mingle with this mob, I'll have to hunt myself a job." Judging from a note at the bottom of the flyer, explaining how people could order the poem in lots of 100 and 500 copies, Chappelle clearly thought that Rejected had a market. As we'll see, he wasn't wrong in thinking so, but even he could have had no idea what its future had in store. When we think of Depression-era literature today, we tend to think of books, especially novels. Perhaps John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, published in 1939, a year after Chappelle started printing Rejected. Or Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston, published in 1937. Or Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind from 1936. Or Richard Wright's Native Son, published in 1940. Maybe some of us think of the hybrid photography and journalism collaborations between Erskine Caldwell and Margaret Bourke-White, or James Agee and Walker Evans, also published within 2 or 3 years of Rodabau's poem. As Chappelle's flyer suggests, however, Depression-era literature also happened outside of books and outside of recognizably literary spheres. Depression-era America was saturated with newspapers in every town, sometimes multiple newspapers in a single small town, many of which printed poetry on a regular basis. It was swamped with mass-market magazines and periodicals like Life or Ladies' Home Journal, or political magazines like The Crisis, put out by the NAACP, or The New Masses, put out by the Communist Party, all of which included literature. Readers found literature in pamphlets, church bulletins, handbills, flyers, trade journals, in pulp fiction and dime novel genre markets like fantasy, westerns, and mysteries, at civic events and school, and in radio shows and film adaptations like The Wizard of Oz, Little Women, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Mutiny on the Bounty. As you think about what might comprise the category of literature of the Great Depression, consider that in the 1930s alone, Zane Grey published about 20 Western novels, and Earl Stanley Gardner published 15 Perry Mason novels. Agatha Christie published 12 Hercule Poirot novels in the 1930s and debuted her character of Miss Marple. Dashiell Hammett introduced Detective Sam Spade. Audiences found 14 Ellery Queen novels and the late work of science fiction writer H.P. Lovecraft. Superman and Batman comics premiered in 1939 and Wonder Woman in 1941. The Federal Writers Project, a branch of the WPA administered at the national, state, and district levels, hired unemployed writers, teachers, historians, and librarians to produce articles, pamphlets, oral histories, plays, and books on U.S. life, including the state-by-state American Guide series and the 17 volumes and more than 2,300 first-person accounts that make up slave narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States. During the same time, the people's poet Edgar Guest was writing a poem a day for the Detroit Free Press newspaper that was syndicated to 250 other newspapers nationwide for an estimated daily circulation of 10 million. That's Guest pictured on the screen here. He made enough money writing poetry to afford a mansion staffed with servants and a summer home. He was good friends with Henry Ford His books were printed in editions of 100,000, and he couldn't go out in public without getting hailed down by enthusiastic readers. He was probably the most famous poet in the United States, but he wasn't the only celebrity poet, not even in Detroit. Across town in the Motor City, Anne Campbell, dubbed the poet of the home and Eddie Guest's rival, and pictured here, was keeping pace by writing a poem every day, 6 days a week for the Detroit News. She earned about $140,000 a year in inflation-adjusted dollars, well over the equivalent of $1 million in 10 years, during the Great Depression. Between Guest and Campbell, nearly 7,000 poems went out from Detroit alone during the 1930s. If Hollywood movies and dime novels offered a way to escape or cope with the Depression, Guest, Campbell, and others like them were the poetic equivalent. Here's part of the poem, "It Couldn't Be Done" by Guest. Somebody said that it couldn't be done, but he, with a chuckle, replied that maybe it couldn't, but he would be one who wouldn't say so till he'd tried. So he buckled right in with a trace of a grin on his face. If he worried, he hid it. He started to sing as he tackled the thing that couldn't be done, and he did it. And here is "To My Child" by Anne Campbell. You are the trip I did not take. You are the pearls I did not buy. You are my blue Italian lake. You are my piece of foreign sky. You are my Honolulu moon. You are the book I did not write. You are my heart's unuttered tune. You are a candle in my night. You are the flower beneath the snow, in my dark sky a bit of blue, answering disappointment's blow with, I am happy, I have you. There was no reason for Chappelle to think that Rejected was destined to find a large audience, or that it would prove to be financially lucrative. But there was also no reason for him to think, as he opened pages or magazines with poems by Guest or Campbell or any number of other poets, that that was entirely out of the realm of possibility either. American literature has always been political, and for writers during the Depression, politics by and large revolved around four main concerns: the economic crisis, white supremacy, lynchings, and the continued racial inequity of Jim Crow laws, the rise of fascism abroad, first in Spain and then Nazi Germany, and the ways that the Russian Revolution and the establishment of a communist state might or might not be a way of addressing or countering problems in the U.S. For many people, the idea of that revolution, not even 20 years old when FDR was elected president, captured the imagination as a social model with aspirations of economic and racial equity at its core, and many authors were among the most prominent Americans to think about and imagine what might be possible. In the lead up to the 1932 presidential election, in which FDR defeated Herbert Hoover to win his first term, for example, a group of more than 50 well-known writers published a 32-page pamphlet urging people to vote for the communist ticket of William Foster and James Ford. Titled "Culture and the Crisis," an open letter to the writers, artists, teachers, physicians, engineers, scientists, and other professional workers of America, the pamphlet sought to address the underlying causes of the Depression and called for economic and racial justice that would be brought about by solidarity between workers. Practically everything that is orderly and sane and useful in America was made by two classes of Americans, they wrote: our class, the class of brain workers, and the lower classes, the muscle workers. They called out the 1%, the banks, railroads, and other corporations that, in their words, offer nothing to the poor except higher taxes, lower wages, and the chance to share their misery. If they, the poor, ask for more, the writers continued, they get bayonets and tear gas. Democrats weren't spared either. If Democrats are elected, they wrote, a different gang will run the machine for the profit of the same owners. And they summed up the national predicament as they saw it in the following way. The United States under capitalism is like a house that is rotting away. The roof leaks, the sills and rafters are crumbling. The Democrats want to paint it pink. The Republicans don't want to paint it. Instead, they want to raise the rent. Sherwood Anderson signed it. John Dos Passos signed it. Theodore Dreiser and Langston Hughes signed it. Former Vanity Fair and New Republic editor Edmund Wilson signed it. Erskine Caldwell, whose novel God's Little Acre would become a Depression bestseller, selling over 10 million copies, signed it. And 2 years later, many of its signers helped to start the League of American Writers, an organization founded by the Communist Party with which Steinbeck, Ernest Hemingway, Upton Sinclair, Lillian Hellman, and many others would eventually affiliate. Many of them would also face consequences for doing so. Publicly opposing fascism, and in some cases even going overseas to participate, many writers supported the communist side of the Spanish Civil War, opposing Francisco Franco's nationalists who received support from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy between 1936 and 1939. When the U.S. entered World War II, many of those same writers became involved in the U.S. fight against Germany as well, sometimes enlisting and frequently working with the Writers' War Board, the main domestic propaganda organization in the U.S. during the war. In its first year alone, the Writers' War Board recruited over 2,000 writers who produced over 8,000 stories, poems, radio plays, essays, editorials, and books to cultivate U.S. public support for the war effort. Despite advocating for social justice in the U.S., despite opposing and fighting fascism abroad before the U.S. government did, and despite the work they did to support the U.S. cause in World War II, many of these writers were ultimately punished for their commitment. After the war, in 1953, for example, despite having worked for the Writers' War Board, and despite having gone to Spain to report on the war, Langston Hughes was brought to testify before Joseph McCarthy's Senate subcommittee because of views he expressed in the 1930s. The subcommittee cited and read into the Senate record poems, including One More S in the USA, in which Hughes's speaker imagines a united socialist states of America, and which reads, in part, "But we can't join hands together so long as whites are lynching black. So black and white in one union fight and get on the right track. By Texas or Georgia or Alabama led, come together, fellow workers. Black and white can all be red." Poet George Oppen, who volunteered to fight in the war and received a Purple Heart, left the U.S. to avoid the same harassment. For years, the FBI kept large case files on numerous authors who had publicly supported civil rights or economic justice in the 1930s. The file on poet Muriel Rukeyser is 121 pages long. The ones for Hemingway and Steinbeck are just as long. The one on Hughes, pictured on the screen here, it's over 550 pages long. All of this has made me wonder about the fact that Rejected was so consistently printed anonymously. Who was V.M. Rodabaugh, and why haven't I found that name anywhere else except on Chappelle's flyer? Did Chappelle just make it up? How possible is it that he, Chappelle, a staunch Republican opposed to FDR and likely having no sympathies with the left-leaning authors I've mentioned earlier, except a mutual opposition to FDR, was nevertheless also worried about the repercussions of his writing? Worried enough, perhaps, to adopt a pseudonym? I don't think I'm 100% right, but I also don't think I'm wrong in thinking that Rodabaugh was in fact the real-life publisher of the Three States newspaper. Paul Irwin Fox was born in 1893 and grew up in north-central Ohio, not far from the cities of Ashland and Medina. Except for 2 years serving in the Army in World War I, he lived his entire life in Ohio, working as a farmer and then as a gas man for the Logan Gas Company and the Ohio Fuel Gas Company. He married in 1920 had one son, and got his life insurance through the All-American Life and Casualty Company. He attended the Dickey Church of the Brethren and was a member of the American Legion's Harry Higgins Post number 88. He died in 1943, not yet 50 years old, 2 days after suffering a stroke while working on a gas well. When Fox died, he left behind a wallet containing the important paperwork in his life: his Army discharge papers, his Social Security card, his marriage license, his insurance paperwork, and one of H.C. Chappell's flyers featuring Rodebau's poem, Rejected. It may seem surprising that Fox would save a poem this way, and we can only speculate about what it represented when juxtaposed as it was with the paperwork of American bureaucracy. But Fox was far from unique in privileging poetry in this fashion. Not only did people carry around poems in their wallets and vest pockets, but they also sent copies to each other through the mail and kept them sandwiched between pages of their books at home. Others took things a step further, devoting extraordinary amounts of time to cutting out verses from newspapers and magazines and pasting them in scrapbooks, thus assembling and editing their own personal poetry collections. I spent about 10 years collecting more than 150 of such poetry scrapbooks that offer intriguing, grassroots, personalized windows onto the literary world, and especially the poetry world, of the Great Depression. Some of these albums are huge, 300 pages long or more. Some of them were compiled over years, sometimes 20 years, sometimes 30 years. Some were assembled with friends and family members. Some are arranged by theme or by author. Sometimes they feel like calendars that run through the year from January through December. Frequently mixing images and text, they are products of a cut and paste culture in which reading was not necessarily solitary, ephemeral, or passive. For me, as an English professor, what's continually surprising is how eclectic in taste these collections can be. The distinctions we might draw between highbrow and lowbrow poetry these days doesn't seem to apply in the same ways. Consider the page spread on the screen, taken from a scrapbook assembled by Doris Ashley, a young woman in her 20s from a working-class family. Her father was a sawyer. She pasted poems over the pages of an old day planner, mixing work by high modernist or avant-garde poets like Ezra Pound and H.D., popular literary poets like Edna St. Vincent Millay and Jean Starr Untermeyer, and newspaper poets like Anne Campbell and Frank L. Stanton. Pound, by the way, was not among the left-leaning writers of the time. He would in fact embrace Mussolini's fascism and move to Italy. That's a longer story for another time that leads us into the 50s. Ashley's scrapbook is like a music playlist, including punk rock, pop, and country western music. But it's hardly a random collection. It's hardly a random assortment at all, as the poems share a common subject and language of gardens, flowers, rain, and springtime. They all orbit a news item on these pages about the writer H.L. Mencken getting married to suffragist, professor, and writer Sarah Powell Hart. It's almost like Ashley is throwing a springtime wedding party on the page and inviting her favorite authors to make a toast at the reception. Or consider the first page of a scrapbook most likely kept by an African-American reader in Pittsburgh. We're familiar with Langston Hughes, whose profile in the African-American newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, occupies a place of prominence at the top of the page. Lest we imagine Hughes as exceptional in his use of poetry for political purposes, we need only look at 2 poems of local Courier verse that have been clipped out of the paper and pasted near the bottom right-hand corner. These poems, too, are openly political. Here, for example, is the poem "We Came to Duke Ellington" by Winfred T. Gilmore, about whom my own internet searches reveal very little. Near the end, the poem refers to Dory Miller, who was the first Black American to be awarded the Navy Cross for manning anti-aircraft guns and tending the wounded during the attack on Pearl Harbor. We came. We came 1,000 strong to marvel the delicate patterns of your music and court the rhythms of your song. We came from Sugar Hill and the west side of the track. Some of us were tan, some brown, but all quite black. In the midst of prejudiced and blind attack, we came, knowing we had done no wrong that would brand us as an inferior throng. But alas, discrimination came along too, paying the self-same price of admittance that his nitwit brothers do. 200 pennies of genuine ignorance. Yes, we came and drank the juices of unripened grapes of wrath. We came and heard your tonal shadings echo, Lincoln, genius disdains a beaten path. As we saw genius exploited and freedom plundered, voices deep down within us thundered. Dory Miller, eternally safe from brutal war, tell us, is this what you died fighting for? Save for blue protesting strains flowing from Hodges' saxophone, no one answered a single word. Nevertheless, we came, we saw, we heard. My personal favorite, however, might be a scrapbook assembled by Paulina Jane Davis on the pages of an old book titled How to Set a Table for Any Occasion. It's probably from the early 1920s, but because it contains mostly recipes cut out from other publications and pasted down on top of the book's original pages, Davis probably kept it for a long time, probably through the Depression. I wish I could show you the actual scrapbook here, but you'll have to trust me when I say that the text block has come loose from the bindings so that many of the pages now fall right out, suggesting that it wasn't just an art project, but was part of her everyday use. Near the beginning of her cookbook, her scrapbook, there is a page on screen here featuring a photograph of two women lounging in bed together. In the upper right corner, the first half of a poem titled Sunday Visitors serves as the page's subject heading. It reads, "There are a number of people who creep into this world to eat and sleep, and know no reason why they are born, but only to consume the corn, devour the cattle, fowl, and fish, and leave behind the empty dish." The photograph itself is titled with another clipping that reads, "Comrades, comrades, sharing each other's noise," which is an adaptation of the refrain from the Victorian-era war song, Comrades, which had the line, "sharing each other's joys, not noise." The photo's caption, halfway down the page, is part of yet another poem, the second half of a Campbell's Soup advertising jingle, typewritten rather than scissored out. It reads, "A feast so beguiling, I have to keep smiling, and trouble just bubbles away." A beguiling Sunday visitor, sharing each other's noise in bed, as the feast on the white tablecloth in the image on the lower half of the page mirrors the feast on the white bed sheets in the photo above. I can't be the only one to see the song of love and desire being constructed or recorded under the sly cover of a cookbook where few people in Davis's homophobic world would be inclined to look. Continuing the theme, yet another repurposed quotation pasted in the bottom right-hand corner of the page reads, "My company 'tis of thee, hungry, internally of thee I sing." It's another song parody, a perplexing one, another excerpt, again skillfully placed in such a way that it takes on new and bittersweet meaning. The thinly veiled metaphorical link between food and sexual desire that hijacks the nationalism of the song "My Country 'Tis of Thee" is sweet and clever and affectionate. I have no idea what the original source of the clipping was, but it sure works in relationship with the other clippings here. At the same time, Davis's implicit recognition that the hunger of this page has to be sung internally and not out loud in public contains the bitterness of love in the closet. This is no sweet land of liberty. There's a lot packed into this page, but I'll leave you with a final thought to chew on. Around this time, Picasso and Braque and members of the Dada art movement were pioneering the use of collage in modernist art. What does it do to our sense of modern art to see Davis using some of the same collage techniques here in her love song? Cut and pasted, parodied, excerpted, quoted, reprinted, sent through the mail, saved in wallets and books, syndicated, and scrapbooked. From advertising jingles to song lyrics and poems by authors we can find in literature anthologies today, poetry offered interactive and participatory experiences that many other literary genres did not. It was on the radio too, and had I more time, I'd tell you about the nationally broadcast poetry radio shows of the 1930s and the ravenous listeners who wrote fan letters and sent in poems they were hoping to hear read on air. It was an early version of long-distance dedications that had to do with poems rather than pop songs. The longtime editor of Poetry magazine, Harriet Monroe, once wrote, "Poetry travels more easily than any other art." I have found the poem Rejected reprinted in Colorado and Washington newspapers, as well as in The American Flint, the official publication of the American Flint Glass Workers Union of North America. A typed copy survives in the papers of former Oklahoma Governor William H. Alfalfa Bill Murray, who remained bitter about losing the 1932 Democratic presidential nomination to Roosevelt. The British journalist Charles Graves remembers being shown a copy of what he called the unkind but not unamusing skit while traveling by train in the U.S. in 1938 and 39. This was, he wrote, the first copy of 5 or 6 afterwards pressed into my hand during the tour. People recall memorizing the poem as children. They recall their parents reciting it to them. A copy was even sent to Eleanor Roosevelt, who discussed it in her nationally syndicated My Day newspaper column. Students at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute turned Rejected into a drinking song. Others have found it in their grandparents' or parents' scrapbooks, tucked into the pages of an old dictionary, and, interestingly, among the belongings of World War II GIs. One vet whom I interviewed said he got his copy in basic training. Perhaps the most thought-provoking part of the circulation history of Rejected, however, may be what we can imagine as its international publication. Sometime, probably in the early 40s, the Nazi propaganda machine discovered it. Maybe a German operative working in the US found it. Maybe it was found on the body of a dead or captured soldier who received a copy in basic training or who carried it from home. Realizing it had the capacity to undermine US soldiers' resolve by maligning the president, the Nazis reproduced it as a little 4-page booklet featuring an extremely toothy caricature of FDR on the title page, pictured here, that illustrates the toothy smile described in lines 7 to 8. Then Franklin D., with his usual guile, stepped forth and flashed his toothy smile. Those pamphlets were stuffed into propaganda rockets, specially designed to open mid-air, and then they were fired over Allied lines, where the poem rained down on U.S. troops fighting during the Battle of the Bulge in 1944 and 45. Who knows how many copies of Rejected, thousands, hundreds of thousands, were ultimately produced by Germany. And if it hurts the brain a little bit to imagine that German propaganda might have originated in a place as far away as Middlesboro, Kentucky, it's even more provocative to wonder about the experience of those U.S. troops who had first read the poem as private citizens or military recruits, and then promptly found themselves rereading it as Nazi propaganda in Europe. When my grandmother sent letters to my grandfather during World War II, he was in the Navy and stationed in the South Pacific, and she wrote to him almost daily. She occasionally peppered her correspondence with poetry. As the history of Rejected suggests, this was probably not the only literature he encountered. Poetry and fiction circulated in pocket-sized books designed for GIs and distributed for free by the Council on Books in wartime. The Armed Services edition of The Great Gatsby that you see here is the version of the book that many people have credited with fueling the novel's post-war popularity. Poetry would have come to my grandfather via screen as well. Created by Frank Capra and voiced by Mel Blanc, the Warner Brothers cartoon character of Private Snafu starred in over 25 animated video shorts shown to military personnel, many narrated in rhymes written by none other than Army Air Force Captain Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. One, cautioning soldiers about the importance of keeping quiet about military operations when they return to the States, begins, for example,
"A returning hero has, no doubt, a million things to talk about. Safe at home, away from battle, restricted stuff makes harmless prattle.
Our outfit's number 999. Now we hold the center of the line. The British hold the hills just west. A pillbox here, machine gun nest, 200 medium tanks, the best."
Now you've got that off your chest.
Another, about the dangers of starting rumors, begins, "'Twas a bright sunny day, with the air fresh and clean. Not a rumor was stirring, except in the latrine." You can find most of these videos online. So when you have a moment after this lecture, look them up and see the somewhat racy, sometimes raunchy, poetry-narrated exploits and internal military propaganda of these films. They're fascinating. On their own, and in partnership with the Writers' War Board, writers of all genres, many of whom couldn't have seen themselves cooperating with the government just a few years earlier, contributed to this body of work by rallying a frequently unsympathetic or uncooperative U.S. public to the war effort. The names in the Writers' War Board files are many. Rex Stout, who had co-founded the communist magazine The New Masses, established it at the request of the Department of the Treasury 2 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Langston Hughes, Eugene O'Neill, Thornton Wilder, Edward R. Murrow, Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, Pearl Buck, and others were involved. Writers promoted particular campaigns for things like selling war bonds, or rationing resources, or recruiting nurses, and even keeping victory gardens. When the Department of Agriculture tapped House and Garden editor Richardson Wright to lead the Victory Garden campaign, for example, he immediately wrote to 36 fiction writers, encouraging them to tackle Crop Corps romances. He wrote to 56 other writers asking for newspaper articles and editorials. And he contacted 17 poets, including E.B. White, Ogden Nash, Edgar Guest, Ira Gershwin, Russell Crouse, Oscar Hammerstein, Margaret Whittemer, Phyllis McGinley, and Cole Porter. He asked of them, "Will you spare the time to turn out something on the joys of farm labor or what you get from working with the green growing things of earth?" This was distinguished company he was writing to. Gershwin, Millay, and Whittemer had won Pulitzer Prizes. Krauss would win one in 1946. Hammerstein won in 1944 and 1950, and McGinley would win in 1961. Wright's office offered to publish the work for free, as was the case with most Writers' War Board arrangements. But out of concern for the poets' financial well-being, he also encouraged them to market the material through your usual outlets. As with reading Rejected, context matters. Who's to say that these poets didn't pass on the invitation to friends and colleagues, and that any poem about nature or flowers or onions or the green growing things of earth printed or even reprinted during this time might be read as part of the Victory Garden propaganda campaign? I imagine Wright coming upon a reprint of William Carlos Williams' famous Imagist poem from the 1920s, The Red Wheelbarrow, for example, and counting it an unqualified propagandistic success. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. To my mind, one of the most noteworthy pieces of literature to come out of the Writers' War Board is now hardly remembered at all, in large part because critics have chalked it up to being nothing more than propaganda, and even its writer eventually disowned it. Nevertheless, it's a startling example of the many ways in which people encountered literature, and especially poetry, in Depression-era America. In June of 1942, after accusing the Czechoslovakian town of Lidice of harboring resistance fighters, Nazi troops, under Hitler's direct order, invaded the town. Those troops executed its male residents, removed the women and children to concentration camps, slaughtered the town's animals, burned the town's buildings to the ground, and even dug up and burned the bodies in the town cemetery. Afterwards, the Nazis would internationally brag that they had erased Lidice from the map. Taking up the massacre as a rallying cry, the Writers' War Board immediately launched the Lidice Lives campaign, and among other things, asked the popular Pulitzer Prize-winning and activist poet Edna St. Vincent Millay to participate. In fewer than 3 months, Millay responded with a long, dramatic, and multi-voiced poem titled The Murder of Lidice that dramatized the massacre from the point of view of a local family, and especially its daughter Beata, who is in love and about to be married when the Nazis invade. Here's how effective the Writers' War Board could be, why it was called the greatest propaganda machine in history. The board wrote to Millay in June of 1942. She sent in the poem by September. Then, in an astonishingly coordinated multimedia plan that had as its stated goal to supply the entire hemisphere with the poem, 4 different versions were released during a single week in October. A short version appeared in the Saturday Review of Literature. An expanded version went out to the 3 million subscribers of Life magazine. A book version was published, and a live version performed by Hollywood actors in front of 1,400 people at NBC's studios in New York was not only broadcast on national and international radio, but was also simultaneously performed in Spanish and Portuguese and also broadcast around the globe. Not long after, Columbia Records released it as part of a 3-record set. Almost overnight, The Murder of Lidice quite possibly became the most widely distributed American poem in history. I've read fan letters from soldiers writing to Millay to explain how they passed the Life version from bunk to bunk. I've read letters from home audiences responding to the radio show. These letters are in the Writers' War Board and Edna St. Vincent Millay papers collections at the Library of Congress. The FBI undoubtedly took note as well, as Millay was yet another author put under surveillance for the political views she expressed during the 1930s. It's likely that H.C. Chappell read it or heard it in Middlesboro, Kentucky, and that Paul Fox in Ohio did as well. I don't know for sure if my grandfather and grandmother heard it at their home just outside of Cleveland. My grandfather was not yet in the Navy, and my grandmother was 3 months pregnant with my mother. But I do know that a copy of the poem in book form made its way into their small library. Farm kids who came of age during the Depression, my grandparents were not people whom we would today call poetry or literature fans, but they kept that copy of the poem for 50 years until it passed to me after my grandmother's death in 1993. Surprised to learn they'd owned it, I opened it up to discover, sandwiched between its pages, a newspaper photo that my grandmother had placed there after the war in 1946. That photo, on screen here, shows one of the two Nazi officials in charge of carrying out the massacre of Lidice being hanged for war crimes. Millet's poem ends by appealing to the United States to catch the maniac killer responsible for the atrocities at Lidice. My grandmother's clipping adds a new ending to Millet's poem. Mission accomplished. Paul Fox kept Rejected until he died. My grandmother kept The Murder of Lidice until she died. Readers like them had poems memorized. They saved them in wallets and scrapbooks and passed them from hand to hand and through the mail. Every now and again, I get emails from people asking for help identifying verses that family members once recited or poems they half remember that date back to the 1930s. A lot of Depression-era literature stays with us, even though we don't particularly associate it with the Depression. Perry Mason, Agatha Christie, H.P. Lovecraft, Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. At the end of this snapshot that I've given you of the lived literary climate of the Depression, I could therefore give you a hefty reading list. Steinbeck, Caldwell, Hughes, Rawlings, Rukeyser, Claude McKay, Hurston, Gertrude Stein, Buck, T.S. Eliot, Williams, Hemingway, Virginia Woolf, Faulkner, Dos Passos, Hammett, Aldous Huxley, Laura Ingalls Wilder, J.R.R. Tolkien, and so on. In part because I've been hoping to show you some of the guts of Depression literature, I'm not going to give you that list, though. Instead, I want to send you on a scavenger hunt. Talk to your family members. Talk to your friends. Look in closets and attics and diaries and letters and photo albums. On screen, by the way, are pictures that my grandmother took of my mother, my mother's aunt, and my mother's grandmother in Detroit during the war. Check out eBay. Spend time with people who remember the Depression or stories about the Depression, and ask what they read, ask what they viewed, ask what they listened to, ask what they talked about, memorized, or learned at school, work, home, church, labor unions, social organizations, and so on. The literature of the Great Depression, spelled out with a capital letter L in literature, will be here when you get back, safely stored on library shelves and preserved in durable formats. That's not necessarily the case with the lived literature of the Depression, however. Literature spelled out with a lowercase l that hasn't been curated, considered, or cared for in the same way. But it too is full of compelling stories to discover if we're willing to take the time to look.